François Chollet.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
I'm Matt the Data Scientist.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. This week we are talking about artificial intelligence. And we've got our guest Matt here to help us through this because, you know, they actually work in the field rather than being a kind of enthusiastic observer like myself. But specifically, we're going to read two articles by François Chollet, The Implausibility of Intelligence Explosion and What Worries Me About AI. So this is kind of a requested episode from Matt, really, realistically. So why are we reading these ones?
So I see a lot of speculation about like what AI what could be classified as AI is going to do. And, there are things to worry about, but I think there's just a lot of hype about things that really just aren't dangerous. And, I think it's kind of cool that, that Francois here has really pegged what's actually dangerous about it as really just being inherent to capitalism. Like it's not, the Terminator is not what we should be afraid of. Like it's not really. That I would bet any amount of money that we're way more likely to die just from capitalists being capitalists with AI than from the AI like developing a self.
Yeah. And so I guess Chollet's two articles here. We have The Implausibility of Intelligence Explosion and What Worries Me About AI. They really do narrow in on sort of like from a grounded, practical perspective what these actual dangers are, and kind of get into how they relate to society. I would say that's maybe the more weaker side of this, but it's definitely valuable to look at this from like the perspective of an actual practitioner in the field.
Yeah, I think that's pretty important here. Is that the author is works in deep learning at Google and is the creator of this a popular framework for machine learning, Keras. So like kind of a big player in the field, right? This isn't some fucking drive-by critique from, somebody who learned linear regression. And then, this is coming from the kind of the heart of the kind of the field, really. Cracking on. The first article, this is also in chronological order. So the implausibility of intelligence explosion kind of is about this this notion of like super intelligence, right? This kind of singularity thing, the thing that everyone sort of talks about when it comes to AI, and how it's basically impossible or like very, very unlikely. And that it's all the kind of wrong framing, right? But to get kind of kicked off here, he opens up with this like quote about intelligence explosion, like that. You have this ultra-intelligent machine that is able to kind of design a more intelligent version of itself in this kind of recursive boot loop. Yeah, and that's a pretty, common thing, right? This is a meme that's been with us for a long time, this notion of a singularity, and is, I would say, accepted faith amongst the kind of, like, Silicon Valley tech sort of crowd, basically, Matt, what's your sort of perspective on that?
Yeah. I mean, like, I spent way too much energy arguing with effective altruism types on Facebook who thinks that that this is more plausible than climate change, which is just psychotic. Like that's just obviously false.
I've very much had the same sort of thing of like. Honest to fucking God, you get these arguments of like, we shouldn't worry about any existing injustices. We shouldn't worry about climate change because within a handful of years, AI is going to bootstrap itself into existence and all our worries will be over. And like, or even, you even get sort of stuff like, you shouldn't inconvenience that process in the now because the rewards that are on the other side of that process are so much larger than you can imagine. That kind of fucking bullshit. And it's like, yeah.
And like it's wild because like not that they would necessarily make this connection, but I mean like it is like the baseline of Whig history that just is, you know, especially like for people who have like a science or engineering education, like you know that is like you know, it's an idea that's so embedded you don't even realize it had an origin in time and space. The idea is that like we're just on this, you know, we're on this rocket and it's going up, and the most important thing is to just not disturb the rocket. You know, we just got to keep, you know, where it's going is good. You know, we just got to keep letting it do its thing, and until we get there.
Yeah, which is horseshit, of course.
I actually just saw on Facebook today there was a post by Andrew Feenberg, who we covered previously on the show, talking about similar concerns with the direction of philosophy of technology. That many philosophy of technology people are now writing quite excitedly about transhumanism, but are basically ignoring the reality of climate change. Like, they may not be deniers, but they are like not putting their research interests there. They're putting their research in this kind of pie in the sky promise of immortality or human transcendence that has a whole lot of buzz and money behind it.
Yeah, I mean, buzz and money is definitely the thing there. I mean, like, I find that stuff especially fucking comical because, like, you know, in recent years you've had stuff like in say Texas, like, it's been too hot for airplanes to operate. Like, the wheels start to melt and the electronics melt down, and it's like, how do you plan on running these fucking AI clusters when silicon melts at atmospheric fucking temperatures, you know, and just like...
More air conditioning!
More, yeah.
Like, that's not even a joke.
Yep. I wish we were joking about this. This is dumb and very disturbing.
And like that's all fine, but like, you know, like if you have that, but you also everything, you know, every economic endeavor has like a legal obligation to put, you know, extracting profits for the literal vampires who own it above all other concerns. You get a dystopia. Like I mean, like, there's nothing wrong like with this technology, and I don't, and a lot of it I think is kind of feasible. But I mean, like, you know, I think that's kind of what Shelley kind of touches on, which is part of what I think is cool about the article, is that, you know, like, there's like a rumbling of sort of realizing, oh, like, you know, people who have a lot of money just owning all this stuff and making all the decisions based off of it, you know, like, as this technology gets more powerful, like, that will lead to some very dark places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. But the argument in this article specifically is that this is actually a really wrong-headed way of thinking about machine learning and the future of this technology. That the fundamental mistake here is that it sort of regards intelligence as a kind of superpower that is just a sort of linear vector, right? You just increase intelligence and that's a superpower.
No agreed upon definition of it by psychologists, for the record.
Mm-hmm, yeah. But like the stuff that is agreed upon, or the stuff that is like actually, you know, doing the rounds in neuroscience and psychology and stuff, is all kind of contrary to what the popular narrative is here. It's a very sort of primitive understanding of intelligence. And the author, to quote from the article, this science fiction narrative contributes to the dangerously misleading public debate that is ongoing about the risks of AI and the need for AI regulation. In this post, I argue that intelligence explosion is impossible, that the notion of intelligence explosion comes from a profound misunderstanding of both the nature of intelligence and the behavior of recursively self-augmenting systems. So yeah, just flat out a fucking misunderstanding. The base misunderstanding is considering intelligence in this completely abstract way, right? This kind of brain in a jar notion of intelligent systems that is frankly fucking laughable. Like, it's cartoonish. And as he says, it's sci-fi, basically. It's a fucking dumbass idea, yeah.
And I mean, we've seen all this before, right? Like, we've seen this in the discussion of sort of like 1980s information society theory, and how that sort of increasingly went in idealist directions that were talking about like transcending the flesh and entering this this realm of pure mind and this kind of thing. And that, like, that kind of idealism is ironically where this concept of intelligence seems to come from, that the mind is something apart from the world that can act upon the world. And, despite the fact that their concept of intelligence that they're developing involves, enormous data clusters, which are very material, once again, the sort of temptation of idealism seizes this sort of group of researchers. Yeah.
We're not against transhumanism in any way. Let's all become robots. What is flexible is you're So you are embodied. But what that means is very flexible. When people you give them a little robot arm to control in a way, when they test out artificial limbs, people get used to having 3 arms very quickly. Your self concept is very malleable. I don't have a problem with any of that, actually. It's more we don't even have a research program that conceivably leads to a being that an artificial intelligence that's sapient in the way that a human is. Because we actually do have intelligences that improve themselves. Using machine learning things to improve other machine learning things, because there's larger parameters that go into other stuff. In praise of planning, by the way, I've been using this tool called Dragonfly that DARPA developed and open sourced very generously to use it's layers of stuff. It's using statty things to optimize other statty things in this whole chain. But here's the thing: toward what end? Toward what I want it to do. The idea of a mind that can sort of step out of its task. We are not even we don't know the road that leads there. Not even close. If you ever read Gerdella Scherbach by Douglas Hofstadter, he's very frustrated with the directions of AI, and for the things that he's interested in, we really haven't made progress since the 70s, or maybe his specific research group, FARG, which is pretty interesting actually. Or if anything's going to lead to that, that's going to lead to that. But right now what they're mostly doing is creating things that sort of manipulate strings in some interesting ways, which is very cool. But I mean, that does not lead to Skynet. For at least another 3 centuries, I would say.
Yeah, totally. And the kind of the sort of argument being made in the article here is also that in the kind of in a sort of general sense, we make this mistake of thinking about general intelligence, where there's actually no such thing. That intelligence is always situational, and the brain is embodied in the body, and the body is embedded in an environment. And so the brain, body, and senses and environment are deeply sort of entangled with each other. And he touches on this idea here that and this is kind of proven on paper. There's this no free lunch theorem that kind of verifies that increasing and I suppose to situate this properly, one of the common notions of intelligence that's used in machine learning and in sort of the sciences is performance at solving problems or performance at playing games. And the no free lunch theorem basically states that improving performance in one area necessarily decreases performance in another area. So you can't have a broadband overall high-performing intelligence. It necessarily, I guess it's like the sort of problem where you have in electronics and sensors, where it can be either fast or accurate but not both. It's this kind of there's fundamental trade-offs where you're increased performance at playing chess necessarily means losing performance at playing Go, and likewise. So even just the foundational idea is nonsense. A general intelligence that will be excellent at everything is kind of fucking crazy. What we actually have in the world are specialized intelligent systems. Specialization is a thing that it seems that the world just does, right? To solve problems. That a proliferation of specialized intelligences is what we empirically observe in the world.
And the closest thing to real general intelligence, or what Douglas Hofstadter would say, is the difference between machine intelligence and human intelligence is the ability to sort of have a bunch of little small very specific formal systems that you can sort of jump out of and jump between. and and like create on the fly, that is nowhere close to that. Well, yeah, not even that's not. That's not something we're even heading towards, as far as I can tell.
I think my favorite sort of analogy for that is the whole thing of like, you interview the king of the monkeys, and he's like, our guys, they're so good at climbing trees. They're climbing farther than ever, farther up the trees faster than ever. Pretty soon we're going to reach the moon. You don't realize what's going to happen at the top of the tree, do you? But
to some extent, this article kind of reminded me of Hubert Dreyfus's critique of good old fashioned AI, in that it's basically criticizing the conception of intelligence that is commonly held, right? Dreyfus was doing it from this kind of Heideggerian phenomenological perspective, but that sort of gets to the points about embodiment and like extended intelligence and the situatedness of intelligence that come up in this article. So there does seem to be some kind of continuity between those sort of perspectives.
One of the sort of examples that the author uses here as well is this, like an octopus, its brain or its sort of mind system is optimized for piloting an octopus body, and the same goes for human. And that realistically you couldn't transplant a human mind into an octopus body because there is actually a sort of hard-coded brain-body mapping that you can't swap around.
It's actually quite interesting. Like that example seems a little bit far-fetched, but
it's what they talk about though. Like so many of these fucking general intelligence guys. It's like, you could just like take a mind as a completely isolated object and just plop it into a robot body or whatever, and it would just go do the thing.
Well, I know like some of like Jerome Lanier's early work was basically like trying to develop some form of like octopus embodiment for people, right? So that like we could imagine ourselves to have that sort of body or manipulate that sort of body. So there's like there's actually kind of a practical research program history behind this example.
Right.
It's a thing that people in Silicon Valley have been thinking about for quite some time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of remarkable, right? That like this is the remarkable gap to me, right? That like it's on the one hand you have this very simplistic understanding of intelligence, which is very popular, right? Like it's the kind of the common way of thinking about this stuff, even amongst the sort of Valley crowd. And then you have the fact that this has been widely sort of studied. It's not unmapped territory at all, and like all of the actual evidence points in the opposite direction, but people like like your fucking Kurziles and all these other goons and like Land and all these fucking Egypts, like they all sort of believe in this other really simplistic kind of naive understanding of intelligence as this generality.
Yeah, the Kurzweil chart. Yeah, what makes you think that processing bits is actually what maps onto this?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's not. Yeah.
Yeah, but exactly. What is the justification for believing it? And I think for so many, like I think specifically for like Kurzile's case, like I think the dead giveaway with him is that he has this weird sort of like mollusk-based diet to like preserve his life long enough to witness the singularity. And I think it's an article of faith that like it is really just good old-fashioned religion, like that he's mortally afraid of death in the old-fashioned way. Like you take an example like the guy we love to hate, like Nick Land, and his whole thing about like capital as an artificial intelligence, and it's very clear that he's afraid of the whole the Great Barrier or whatever, that thing of like, why don't we see intelligent species all over the universe? Because there's this great barrier that prevents them from leaving their planets. And I think for him it's an article of faith that like or also, I think it's also kind of like psychologically tied in with a sort of subconscious admission that everything's kind of fucked because of climate change. That like, if organic intelligence is doomed, then, it's more comforting to believe that an artificial intelligence will escape Earth. I think it really is just faith in that kind of regard,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's so that's the thing of like, I mean, I'm glad you brought it up. Like, I mean, why believe this? Like, what's the reason for thinking this way? I don't think there is a good reason for thinking this way. It's just that, like, it is comforting to believe that general intelligence as a sort of god form would bootstrap itself and escape, because it's better to believe that than to believe that the most likely outcome for this world is to turn into Venus, you know?
And like, if you think of capitalism as being non-negotiable, like, you know, I guess, you know, oh, so I guess, you know, humanity's going to die because of climate change, or, you know, or just be very, very reduced. I either need to, like, get on board with that, or, you know, like, really create the worst version of it in my head, and, like, I've sort of conquered it. You know, but by, oh, you know, so there's all these horrible things that this could be. Like, what's the most, like, vile, you know, racist, you know, just evil, like, version of this? Why don't I use and by adding my creativity to that, I've defeated climate change in my head in terms of, like, managing my own terror.
Yeah, sure, definitely. It's fucking
He's such a boring thinker. Like, I was so disappointed when I heard him, when like I looked into him a little bit. You know, just like what if all my most, like, pig ignorant fucking prejudices? What if that was just reality? Like
exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, god damn. Yeah, but yeah, I don't know. Like, this stuff really does strike as just articles of faith, right? Like, or even I suppose, like, in the case of, like, that classic thought experiment of, like, Rocco's basilisk, that is just Pascal's wager, right? Like, it's Pascal's wager for nerds. So it's just a fucking cult, really.
But yeah, help the basilisk. Yeah, yes, help build up the productive forces. You know, like, you know, Pascal's wager. You know, combine them, actually. You know, think that you need to help the poor. You know, to hedge your bet with Pascal's wager, and think you need to you know, help the productive forces to please the basilisk. You please them both. You know, and we're heading in a good direction.
Yeah. Anyway, moving on a little bit in the article, the author hits up on a very important point here, that, like, culture is absolutely crucial to the development of intelligence. That, like, you take a human child and dump them in the wilderness, and, like, you know, they go feral and they live with the wolves or whatever. They end up with zero intelligence in the kind of classic sense. They don't develop language. They don't develop, like, any of the kind of stuff you'd expect. It's very much like that intelligence development is a social process, not something that occurs entirely inside the skull of the individual. Which, again, is a very upsetting notion for a lot of the faithful. For the faithful of this faith, it's like they would recoil at this notion that intelligence is social rather than an individual thing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Fuck them.
When you're working in such a, like, you know, quote unquote meritocratic system, where your education and your performance on tests and so on is a sign that you're one of the elect. You know, this idea of social intelligence is really quite repulsive. I would imagine.
Oh, totally. I've seen it happen. You know, like the like recoiling in horror. I don't know, these people and their fucking thought processes. There's a really good little quote here that I want to read out, because I think it touches on something very crucial, that if intelligence is fundamentally linked to specific sensor motor modalities, a specific environment and a specific upbringing, and a specific problem to solve, then intelligence expansion can only come from a co-evolution of the mind, its sensor motor modalities and its environment. So that shifts the emphasis very much out of the brain in a jar into co-evolution of brain and equipment and environment. And this reminded me of some stuff we've covered before with, like, the Culture series of fictions, right? Where in the fiction of the Culture, the culture emerges as a deliberate co-evolutionary design process between the organic members and the designed minds. And that over the process of billions of years, they sort of design each other and bootstrap that way.
Yeah, it's much more plausible than the idea of this sort of seed intelligence that is just going to blow up of its own accord. Yeah.
It's like there are, like, design choices like that you just, like, have to make. Yeah, and like it can't just exist as this totally fluid intelligence. And like you get to decide what gives it pleasure. Like let's say that you actually did have something that could create like a sort of general intelligence. You have to decide, like what fuels like goal-directed behavior. And so, like, the idea that it would just be this thing that has its own inscrutable agenda is really probably not the case. Like, you would design it to enjoy, like certain things. You would, you would design it to, like have like feedback from humans, be like, like part of, just really a fundamental part of how it operates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. There's a really sort of important point here as well that, like, if we go back to this framing of intelligence being success at games or success at various tasks, empirically, like, we have geniuses, right? And we've known a few of them throughout history. They don't tend to live twice as long as normies. Like there seems to be a kind of diminishing return on intelligence, in fact, that like in fact many, like, I mean, the point here as well is that, like, success in, say, the sciences is very much a collaborative, collective sort of thing, and like a lot of the best scientists we've ever had, like Feynman and these kind of guys, have had very middling IQs. Like they were. I think that the thing here, the predictor of success, is not so much to do with individual IQ as it is to do with, like, being in the right place at the right time with the right set of skills. Again, a huge shift in emphasis, right? Like so different from what you'd be led to believe by these goons.
Yeah, and it is it's sort of a myth, this myth of genius that you encounter among researchers and academics. It is really quite persistent, and I think there is a certain there's a certain way in which it plays into people's vanity or just career aspirations, but I think there's also the side of it where researchers who are not a part of a highly active and creative milieu can delude themselves that they are going to make significant research contributions by believing that their creativity and intelligence is somehow inherent to themselves. Because I when I was a doctoral student in Kyoto University, I was in a very low activity, low creativity situation, and really had to confront this problem. Right, that very directly confront this problem. That if you are not in a happening place, you're just not going to be that creative, because intelligence is social, and that can feel very, very isolating, because you're like, oh man, like I'm out of the conversation. How can I possibly do anything? So, yeah, I mean, I think for the people on the inside, then maybe it's flattering that they can think that their ideas come from themselves rather than from a sort of broad social process. But the people on the outside kind of have some buy-in on this too, because they believe like they can be intelligent independent of their circumstances. So yeah, it's quite a persistent idea among brainy types, I think. Yeah, and
I mean that this stuff is brought up as well, that the intelligence isn't in our brain, it's externalized as civilization, right? Like the term used here is cognitive prosthetics, right? Like your kind of gadgets, language processes, and other people are the site of intelligence. It's really not the individual skull. And I think this is the thing we're also familiar with as the general intellect, right?
Yeah, or like you can even think of it like neurons in the brain, or or even ant colonies in like a very observable way. A bigger ant colony literally has more complex behaviors and like will do things that, and it's not just about like the sheer mass. It's the like bigger brained creatures are not necessarily more intelligent. It's the synapses, it's the connectivity and the complexity of the connectivity between them that really, insofar as we know anything, rules zero of neuroscience is we don't actually understand how the brain works. But like that, that complexity seems to be, like the source of all that.
That's very interesting, yeah, because it's all about populations, right? Like it's a population of neurons that makes up the brain, and it's a population of brains that makes up the osseous. It's interesting that we take that sort of take, right? That like we're talking about populations of complex systems recursively making each other up, and all the complex interactions and the emergence there. And I think we can contrast that with the very naive sort of take on intelligence that we've been discussing, which is very kind of like pre-complexity, like it's more of a Newtonian sort of Cartesian thing. There's a sort of a mirroring in the kind of in the science, the sort of like the language of the sciences gives us very different sort of tool sets for thinking about this sort of stuff. And I've noticed something very interesting with a lot of folks that get into the sort of hard sciences, and I think I've noticed it quite a bit with people that get into computer science as well, is that like one of the things that draws them in towards the sciences is the kind of classic Newtonian sort of take of like linearity and order and predictability and all that kind of stuff. It appeals to a very certain kind of mind, right? But then once they get in, they find that the actual stuff is made up of these complex things, right? Like, and you're talking like chaos theory and all that sort of stuff and quantum mechanics instead of the nice, safe Newtonian stuff. And that drives them fucking crazy, right? Like there's a real cognitive dissonance there. And there's a dissonance here as well. There's again an article of faith in this kind of very primitive, linear, safe notion of like intelligence as just a general thing that is, it's just a thing you can have more of or less of or whatever. But then transitioning to considering these populations and complexity and emergence gives you such a different sort of, it's a different sort of outcomes, and like as the author is describing here, like just completely different conclusions. That once you start thinking this way, it becomes evident that recursive sort of self-bootstrapping like singular intelligence is just never going to happen, because like it can't, right? Like we understand the world better now. That has to be seen as a fantasy that you have to kind of let go of, right?
I guess the upside is there is still plenty of interesting research.
Oh, totally,
to be done.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
It's not like it's the end of the road, right? Like it's still it. In fact, once you admit that that's the limit, it sort of opens up a whole field of possibilities, right? That you start to entertain instead. But I just find it's very funny, this kind of where you get these like what are basically emotional investments in a particular model of thought colliding head on with reality. And the messy fallout from that collision, I think, is very entertaining and just funny.
Especially when like one of the things they're emotionally invested in is the illusion that they're not emotionally invested in anything.
Oh, the fucking...
That's funny to see.
Yeah.
That's very entertaining.
I'm not political, I'm just a scientist or whatever. That kind of fucking...
Nah, yeah. You are political and you're not a scientist, Land.
Oh, fuck.
Oh, boy. Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of, like, when Hilbert's, like, Foundations of Mathematics program fell apart in the early 20th century. And there were researchers like von Neumann who sort of took the problems that were come up with there and were just like, okay, well, this is the basis for a new research program. And went on to do extremely creative work based on that.
Is that
yeah?
Is that what Gödel's incompleteness theorem destroyed? Am I getting the history right there?
Yes, that's right. That you got it.
No, it was Russell and Whitehead.
Yeah, they were also involved in that project.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a rather complex history, but yeah.
For the sake of the listeners, Kyle, could you take a shot at explaining just the very short gist of what that was? Because I think it illustrates the same example.
Boy, yeah, okay. Well,
is it just that they thought it was simple and then it turned out to be very complex and they were like, oh, shit?
There was... So if I can try to summon up this history from the back of my memory on a dime...
Warrants an episode in its own right, probably.
Yeah, really, yeah.
We can skip it.
My advisor at Kyoto University wrote quite a bit about this subject because he had a background as a mathematician and did a lot of history. So Yeah, essentially, there was a project within mathematics to prove that it was complete. And this was essentially, if I remember correctly, an attempt to prove that basically all mathematical problems are solvable within the language of mathematics itself. And, Gödel came up with this incompleteness theorem that proved that this was not the case. And it really was a fundamental event of intellectual history in the 20th century because it derailed this sort of idea of scientific and mathematical progress that had built up over the course of the 19th century. And it opened the door for sort of new, less intuitive understandings of mathematics and of science, such as quantum mechanics had relations to this debate, and there were numerous sort of projects that spun off from that. But I think the thing is that there's a similarity between that story and this story of intelligence, because the sorts of more sophisticated understandings of intelligence that we find here are similarly maybe less intuitive to your average person than the kind that is marketed by Kurzweil and that sort of thing, right? That there's a sort of break with comfortable assumptions and a move towards sort of complexity and new uncertainties and new dimensions of understanding that really may change the direction of development quite substantially. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to add drop to that, specifically, Gödel's thing was that any formal system that's complicated enough to basically be useful beyond a very limited application, you're going to have a trade-off between consistency and completeness. You can have a very limited range of what it can apply to, or you can have some contradictions, and that broke a lot of people's brains. But it's also helping us understand brains. So a certain tolerance for inconsistency is part of what is part of the difference between human intelligence and machine intelligence as we understand it, and it's part of the no free lunch theory too, because you're always making trade-offs anytime you make a formal system. You're always the map is not the territory. You're always choosing to illuminate some parts of a system and obscure others anytime you make a formal model of something.
Yeah, and when I mentioned that there were researchers who sort of ran with that result and went on to develop new ideas, there were also researchers for whom the sort of completeness of mathematics was kind of like a religious tenet, and it was tremendously traumatic for them to realize that this project was really done. Right? It was this ain't happening. It's just fundamentally impossible.
So it broke a lot of brains and it broke a lot of hearts, right? That's kind of what we're getting at there.
Yeah, it did. It really did. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think there's a lot of resonance there with this intelligence stuff as well, and I think history is going to repeat itself in that kind of regard. The kind of moving on a little bit, one of the points here as well is that an individual brain cannot be recursively sort of self-augmenting, and this is a kind of empirical observation, but I think it also ties in with the kind of law of requisite variety, right? That a given mind system won't have enough variety to represent all of its underlying substrate, so it won't be able to actually adjust all of its underlying substrate and so on. I think it's kind of, you sort of lose fidelity as you go up in scale, necessarily.
Absolutely. Yeah, like you can't like command your cells to like start doing something different.
Pretty much, right.
People imagine like this AI that controls like a whole like industrial base, the way you control your fingers. But like how many things can you consciously really keep track of at the same time? Yeah, we found like the really is an upper limit of how many like artificial limbs like they can have someone control. Like it's not that many. There's only like maybe like 7 things you can really keep in mind for the most part. Like you're gonna have like layers in a way that
Do you think that's actually like it's just something that very interesting that came up there? Do you think that's actually related to the number of fingers we have? Because like short-term working memory is about 7 or 8 items. Probably. I don't know.
Probably.
That does make sense, right? Like so that puts a pretty hard cap on things. And like, I mean, we do know about recursively self-improving systems, right? We have them. We've seen them everywhere. The world is filthy with them. It's just that they're civilizations and technologies, right? Like they're not singularities. Like this is kind of ridiculous. There's also this kind of idea brought up that like there's a kind of like a sort of exponential increase in like input complexity doesn't yield an exponential increase in output. It's like you get kind of diminishing returns that kind of level off. One of the examples here that he gives is software, right? Like, I mean, the development of software has come on in leaps and bounds since, the 60s or whatever. But is it 200 times better or more useful or like faster to develop? Not really. Like it's kind of largely the same fucking game it's ever been. Or like the time frame he gives here is like the year 2000-ish, right? Like, or 2009. Like, I mean, think about computing in 2000 and then in 2009 and then today. It's like basically the same thing. Like even accounting for the like many thousand-fold increase in like input complexity, the output experience and the kind of experience of developing the stuff is broadly the same. There's friction, right? Like this is a thing that like as the complexity of a system increases, it gets kind of glued up with itself. Like there's friction internally. And this reminds me of a kind of a quip that I can't remember where it came from, and I should probably look it up. But basically, like, if you think you're looking at an exponential curve, it's actually a sigmoid. You just can't see the top of it.
Yeah.
And I think that really makes sense. Right. And yet, like, how are people so fucking excited about hockey stick curves? Like, it's the thing that's people are always talking about in Silicon Valley. It's the underlying assumption of all this AI takeoff stuff is that like, oh, it'll be a hockey stick.
Because it's how you get these these investors to like give you some of their grandfather's United Fruit Company money.
Absolutely. So
that you can try and actually maybe do something useful. Like I feel like there is much revolutionary potential in the startup founder, because like no one hates the people who make investment decisions more than them.
Yep. It ain't gonna happen. So Kyle, I noticed you've got a bit highlighted in the notes here at the end. It's one of the quotes towards the end. Do you want to lead us off at the end of this article on that one?
Yeah, sure. I might read the one prior to that too. So we're talking about the kind of limitations on this sort of system, and it says, when it comes to intelligence, inter-system communication arises as a brake on any improvement of underlying modules. A brain with smarter parts will have more trouble coordinating them. A society with smarter individuals will need to invest far more in networking and communication, etc. It is perhaps not a coincidence that very high IQ people are more likely to suffer from certain mental illnesses. It is also perhaps not random happenstance that military empires of the past have ended up collapsing after surpassing a certain size. Exponential progress meet exponential friction. And then it goes on. In practice, system bottlenecks, diminishing returns, and adversarial reactions end up squashing recursive self-improvement in all of the recursive processes that surround us. Self-improvement does indeed lead to progress, but that progress tends to be linear or at best sigmoidal. Your first seed dollar invested will not typically lead to a wealth explosion. Instead, a balance between investment returns and growing spending will usually lead to a roughly linear growth of your savings over time. And that's for a system that is orders of magnitude simpler than a self-improving mind. Likewise, the first superhuman AI will just be another step on a visibly linear ladder of progress that we started climbing long ago. And then finally, the expansion of intelligence can only come from a coevolution of brains, biological or digital, sensory, motor affordances, environment, and culture. Not from merely tuning the gears of some brain in a jar in isolation. Such a coevolution has already been happening for eons and will continue as intelligence moves to an increasingly digital substrate. No intelligence explosion will occur as this process advances at a roughly linear pace.
Boom. God damn. Yeah, I mean, fuck. Like,
so, I guess I have a couple thoughts about this. I already sort of mentioned how this reminds me of kind of like Dreyfus's critique of good old-fashioned AI, which I guess was sort of an internal debate that was happening within Stanford at the time, right? Dreyfus over in the philosophy department lobbing bombs over at the AI researchers. I think that, you know, there's just a couple things I wanted to bring up. One of them is that this really doesn't get at the sort of texture and nuance of this development, right? Because it's just trying to make a very general point. It's trying to torpedo this idea that the singularity people have, and I think it absolutely succeeds at that. But when we're looking at, okay, so how is this digital substrate developing? I think one thing to sort of pay attention to is like, okay, there's a coevolution of brains, but what does that look like in capitalism? Like, let's think about the armies of either unpaid or severely underpaid people that are working to build these AI machines that we have, and that really doesn't get much of a mention here because it's making such a general point. So I think that is something that's definitely worth thinking about, because when we think about coevolution of brains, it sounds really nice. It's like, oh yeah, like, you know, meeting of the minds, like that's cool. When some of the minds are, you know, getting very different payoffs from other minds, maybe that's not such a cool thing. So we need to think about, like, what is the particular character of that coevolution, I think.
No, absolutely, yeah. Like, if the premise is, and you do agree with it, you know, like, yeah, it's not like making this singular thing. It's all like forming like Voltron into this new larger thing. You know, there's suddenly like the mechanics of that, you know, like start to matter like a whole lot. I put a couple of other subnotes of like, one thing that I thought was cool is how he stresses sort of the continuity between like computers and the institutions around them meeting society, and just, you know, like writing and the institutions meeting society. Yeah, this is like writing and bureaucracy increase the scale of possible collective action projects that can be attempted. Computers plus their new institutions will enable even larger scale collective action, which is cool. But I mean, like, you know, like what does the writing stuff look like? You know, it looks like, you know, Babylon and Egypt and slavery and, you know, the fucking enclosures in Scotland, and, you know, like, there's better and worse ways like for that to happen. You know, it's not like a linear path. There's different ways that can play out.
That's the other point I wanted to bring up, is that, like, the focus on linearity here, I think it doesn't, it's not trying to lead to some kind of Whig history in that sense of linearity, but I think that it kind of reminds me of the ways in which geology has been used as kind of a counter-revolutionary form of rhetoric, right? That like, you know, these like slow, continuous processes. Then you have people who come in and argue for like catastrophism, right? That they're like, oh no, there's discontinuities in this history, right? And I feel like if we push this point too far, it could end up actually becoming a kind of conservative argument, right? Because the people who are pushing this idea of singularity, they take the sort of rhetoric of revolution and try to make it a thing that applies to like this tiny portion of humanity who are going to benefit from this massive discontinuity in human history. And I feel like we need to find like a different way of talking about both the real linearities in development and also the sort of shifts and discontinuities and changes of texture in development, so as to not just sort of like lapse into a extremely one or the other kind of way of talking about this problem.
No, I find like singularity people like kind of like one of three ways of looking at it. You know, one is that, you know, it'll all be enslaved to capitalism, and that's a good thing because like capitalism eventually leads us to something good. Or you know, capitalism leads us to something bad, but you know, bad means good because you know you're you're a kid in a 1980s sitcom explaining that to an adult. Or
it's good. It's the good old cunning of history.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes. Or you know, like you think like I don't know, like the AI will be in charge and the AI will make good decisions for some reason. Yeah, hey, maybe you know of those three. But you know, there is another way of looking at it that you know, a very prescient guy in like the 1840s or so, kind of you know.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so I think we should move on to the next article, which I think was a couple of years later and is a bit more contemporary. What worries me about AI. This kicks off on a very interesting note that he's kind of riffing on the kind of computer phobia of the 80s and 90s, right? The kind of fear of replacement, right? Like kind of these computers are being deployed in office buildings and people are like, oh, scary computer and stuff. And, you know, these radical technological shifts have this kind of unease and maybe panic about them. But eventually everyone gets over it, right? They kind of adjust and the threatening change mutates into a new status quo. And it's kind of that, like, in one way, we're really bad at predicting what's actually going to happen. Like the fears that we have usually don't pan out, but then we completely miss the stuff that we should have been afraid of in the first place. Is kind of the argument here. That like most of our fears are irrational and we miss the actual dangers.
I do feel like in this particular section, Chollet, at the very least, he's certainly making an argument opposite to the one that we found in Graeber's article, right? That like the flying cars and the falling rate of profit. That basically, like, the concerns that labor had over the employment of these technologies by capital were completely unfounded. It seems to be the argument that Chollet makes. And I kind of don't think that's correct.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I think you're right. You're on the right track there because I mean people were afraid of this sort of surveillance stuff. I think he's specifically zoning in on the fear of replacement, which also did pan out. I don't know. Like I mean, yeah, it's not the most powerful argument here.
I think the thing that he's maybe picking up on is that because the effects of automation were not absolute, the fears about automation were unfounded, right? Like he that seems to be the argument that he's making is like that people had these like, you know, this was the era of RoboCop and Terminator, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is the imaginary that birthed those ideas, and he's saying, well, we didn't get those, right? Like that didn't happen. But then you go and look at our world, and it's like, actually, it's like it pretty much like it's not Terminator, but it is very much cyberpunk. Yeah. You know,
yeah.
So there, I feel like there's a little bit like of, well, if it's not 100%, then obviously you were totally wrong. Just because the fear were so outsized, maybe that's the thing he's kind of picking up on. Like the phobia was so intense, and the results were maybe more mediocre than that. Although we still do have like, you know, 6 people who own trillions of dollars. And, like, I mean, like things are pretty bad, but like, yeah,
I agree. Yeah, it's not the strongest foot forward. But he sort of goes on to, it's kind of like preparing for this argument that we are now faced by this new wave of radical change in AI, right? And that we're afraid of mass unemployment and superintelligence. And he's already knocked off superintelligence as a possibility. But that, the question is, what if we're worrying about the wrong thing again? And I'll quote here, in this post, I'd like to raise awareness about what really worries me when it comes to AI, the highly effective, highly scalable manipulation of human behavior that AI enables, and its malicious use by corporations and governments. So, I think what he's trying to say is that, the popular narrative about this stuff is that, it's going to be mass unemployment and this sort of stuff, but, I think he's making this sort of gambit that that probably won't happen. What you'll actually get is a fucking nightmare of surveillance, which people are afraid of. Also, that is a fear.
And I think the graver point would be, why not both?
I think a lot of people would also consider the gig economy like a version of mass unemployment. But I think
I feel that. I feel that on a very real level.
Kind of definitely a shaky start here, right? Most of the article is kind of about social media platforms using AI to kind of do this psychological panopticon thing of very much like what we were talking about in platform capitalism a couple of episodes ago, right? Hoovering up massive amounts of data and then building psychological profiles and then kind of controlling people indirectly through the algorithmic newsfeed and the ads and that sort of stuff. This was written in 2016, I think.
No, I think it was last year.
Okay.
It was 2018.
It's the previous one that was.
Yeah, so it's quite recent.
So,
yes.
It's pretty on the money, and I think the fear of this stuff has only ramped up since, right? This is a risk that everyone's very much aware of now, which I guess throws another spanner in the whole argument that we're very bad at predicting what's bad,
Well, I would say that this stuff was certainly underappreciated when these technologies were first being brought online. When Facebook was first a thing, people would be you had Stallman screaming into the void, about all these sorts of things that he's talking about here. But for most people, it's Facebook friends are awesome. So, I feel like it was never really taken very seriously. So there was a certain amount of us, misapprehending the problem until we had sort of very dramatic examples in our face to look at.
Yeah, I think part of it is that, even if we can't get outmaneuvered, as full general intelligences by, anything that's, artificial, we do have behavioral trigger mechanisms that are hackable, and if all of this is under the control of organizations that are legally obligated to put extracting profits for vampires as their number one concern, trying to hack those behavior circuits to be able to extract profit better from you, that's what they're going to do. And the technology is getting to a point where if that's what it's being used for, we are fucked. That is, we're a different level of fucked.
Yep. Which, yeah, the thing here is about it's kind of you get these technologies used to first build up kind of prediction models, right? What kind of person is most likely to click on this ad, but that rapidly mutates into control, right? It's a closed feedback loop of extracting a model from the people, then tweaking and sort of optimizing, if I show this person a post from the Trump campaign, they'll be furious and be more engaged with Facebook, therefore click on more ads. That kind of, that's the sort of and this means that the Facebook sort of algorithm is basically kind of in control of what you see, your exposure to news, right? And also your exposure to friends and family. I think there's a bit in the article here about the algorithm sort of picking and choosing when it's going to show you posts from your racist uncle, to kind of get you more engaged and get you more sort of fucking thing, right? And it's a closed feedback loop, right? And it's the goal, right?
Yeah, that's the crucial difference between social media platforms and a search engine that he points out, right? Is that these social media platforms allow for more of a closed loop And that enables a much greater degree of control.
Yeah. And it jumped out at me immediately. Like the diagram he uses to demonstrate this is simply a diagram of a homeostat. It's like this is a thermostat essentially.
And like you can do this. 80% of machine learning engineers, like work for Facebook or Google. Like it's that's pretty trouble. And also like a grotesque, like application of resources. The fact that they're working on that and not, making power plants more efficient, that might be the death of all of us.
Yeah, definitely. A fucking huge squandering of a whole generation's worth of intelligence. Yeah, it's fucking grim. And like one of the sort of points he brings up here as well is that like this kind of like generalized manipulation, the kind of manipulation at such huge scales that it can steer the socius in general, like more than just steering individuals, it can steer the entire fucking society. This doesn't require super intelligent AIs. It just requires, linear regression and a lot of compute power.
No, yeah, and like I think the thing that's missing from like an actual super intelligence is like a sort of self that creates objectives. But the thing is, if you just give like a bunch of computing power your objective, which is again extracting profits for literal non-metaphorical vampires, I cannot stress enough that it's not a metaphor. That's what they'll do, and like they'll be very effective at it. Like they're very good at like you give them just like one number, and just try to make the number go up. Like they get very good at that. And like that, if that's the objective, like we're getting very good at building systems that are just capable of optimizing for one objective. And so, I mean, like maybe I'm jumping the gun, being a little bit overly optimistic, but like I feel like there's like a little bubbling of someone kind of realizing, we need to abolish private property. Like we can't have just like someone owning like all this stuff that dictates all our lives and dictating and that person deciding everything that's done with it. All this server infrastructure, all this cloud infrastructure, like that actually shouldn't just be under the control of someone who happens to own it because they inherited a bunch of imperialism money.
Yeah, I would actually love to. I would love to give the author here a copy of Platform Capitalism and really pick their brains as to what they think about it by the end, because like I think a lot of this article and a lot of their sort of take on like how to solve these kind of problems is very much of that kind of like, Facebook needs to have better values sort of thing that we were mocking in that episode.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's beyond a notion of values, right? Like it is systemic and infectious.
Mm-hmm. It matters who decides who makes production decisions. Whether there's democratic accountability or whether it's just one person who owns it really for no particular reason.
Yes. Yeah. I just wanted to read a section of the text here that I think will kind of help to explain what we mean as this sort of crucial difference between search and social media. So there's a section, human behavior is an optimization problem. And it says, in short, social network companies can simultaneously measure everything about us and control the information we consume. And that's an accelerating trend. When you have access to both perception and action, you're looking at an AI problem. You can start establishing an optimization loop for human behavior, in which you observe the current state of your targets and keep tuning what information you feed them until you start observing the opinions and behaviors you wanted to see. So yeah, this is like literally just the targeting problem that Wiener was working on when he came up with cybernetics, right? Like this is like the anti-aircraft gun targeting problem. So a large subset of the field of AI, in particular reinforcement learning, is about developing algorithms to solve such optimization problems as efficiently as possible, to close the loop and achieve full control of the target at hand, in this case, us. By moving our lives to the digital realm, we become vulnerable to that which rules it, AI algorithms.
Mm-hmm. Pretty fucking clear.
Yeah.
Pretty clear.
And so, when we were talking about cybernetics, when we were talking about Pickering's book, he was at pains to explain that, like, control in the cybernetic sense does not necessarily mean control in the sense of domination that we typically think of. But in this case, it could mean that, right? Like, it's very much could be used for that. And Pickering, like, you know, was very clear that, like, yeah, that kind of cybernetics has absolutely always existed. It's just not what he was interested in studying, right? So, like, that is also out there and also quite dangerous. But I don't know. There's these different forms of reinforcement that he goes through. I thought that was one of the most useful parts of the article. Would you be interested in sort of like going through that a little bit more?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the first one is identity reinforcement. And it says, this is an old trick that has been leveraged since the very first ads in history and still works just as well as it did the first time, consisting of associating a given view with markers that you identify with or wish you did, thus making you automatically side with the target view. In the context of AI-optimized social media consumption, a control algorithm could make sure that you only see content, whether news stories or posts from your friends, where the views it wants you to hold co-occur with your own identity markers, and inversely for views the algorithm wants you to move away from. So, like, you know, in the very beginning of advertising is during the Protestant Revolution, right? The use of print to create religious propaganda and help wage wars. In between, we get things like, you know, MTV using communist iconography to make it seem edgy and revolutionary, right? Like, that's the kind of identity reinforcement he's talking about here. But here it's kind of like, oh yeah, so these are the things you identify with, and these are the things that we want you to agree with, and we're just going to put those things together algorithmically, personalized to you and to our objectives. So it's kind of just a more sophisticated form of the old advertising techniques that we all know. And then the second one here is negative social reinforcement. If you make a post expressing a view that the control algorithm doesn't want you to hold, the system can choose to only show your post to people who hold the opposite view, maybe acquaintances, maybe strangers, maybe bots, and who will harshly criticize it. Repeated many times, such social backlash is likely to make you move away from your initial views. Like, this is really the scary shit, right? Like, because I could absolutely imagine, you know, the algorithm just taking like trans people online and exposing them to massive transphobes repeatedly until they are forced off of social media. Like, that is like really horrific shit.
I'll put a fucking year's salary on the fact that does happen. Anyone want to take the other side of that fucking bet?
Yeah.
That definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it is really frightening because, like, this is exactly the sort of thing that leads people to self-harm and commit suicide, right? Like, it's really, really, really frightening shit. And the next one is positive social reinforcement. If you make a post expressing a view that the control algorithm wants to spread, it can choose to only show it to people who will like it. It could even be bots. This will reinforce your belief and put you under the impression that you are part of a supportive majority. So, you could easily imagine that, like, Mark Zuckerberg's personal propaganda campaigns on Facebook could engineer this kind of astroturfed impression of popular support, right? And then we have sampling bias. The algorithm may also be more likely to show you posts from your friends or the media at large that support the views it wants you to hold. Placed in such an information bubble, you'll be under the impression that these views have much broader support than they do in reality. I feel like this is just like straight up like Herman and Chomsky manufacturing consent style, like, sampling bias, right? But, like, you know, they could absolutely do that by being platform holders.
And those last two are also taking advantage of. There's another cognitive bias called I can't believe I'm blanking on the name, but basically it's that availability bias, which is basically that you kind of think that the rate of something has something to do with how easily you can think of an example of it. And so, it creates things like people thinking that air travel is more dangerous than travel by car, even though, it's objectively, much safer, because, like a plane crash makes the news while car crashes don't. And so, like that subjective feeling of, the ease of conjuring a memory is like how you kind of rate the probability there.
Absolutely. And then the final one here is the argument personalization. The algorithm may observe that exposure to certain pieces of content among people with a psychological profile close to yours has resulted in the sort of view shift it seeks. It may then serve you with content that is expected to be maximally effective for someone with your particular views and life experience. In the long run, the algorithm may even be able to generate such maximally effective content from scratch specifically for you. So, we can imagine this could be white supremacy YouTube likes. This could be, anti-Semitic stuff on Facebook, of which there is plenty. And I found quite worrying in my personal interactions with people being like, oh, you're an anti-Semite now? Oh yeah, you use Facebook a lot. Okay, that's fucking scary. Yep. Okay, and yeah, so like that was also the one you were talking about, I think, Shane, with the racist uncle exposure kind of deal, right? Yeah. So in sum, he says, from an information security perspective, you would call these vulnerabilities, known exploits that can be used to take over a system. In the case of human minds, these vulnerabilities never get patched. They are just the way we work. And he goes on to say, the human mind is a static, vulnerable system that will come increasingly under attack from an ever smarter AI algorithms that will simultaneously have a complete view of everything we do and believe and complete control of the information we consume.
Yeah, and what's it? Because we are much more sophisticated. But the behavioral econ way of phrasing it with that, you've got system 1 and system 2. System 1 is intuitive and very fast and works according to all these biases and heuristics, while system 2, is thoughtful and slow. But the thing is, and so it can definitely beat system 1, it maybe can never really beat system 2. But how often are you in system 2? You only maybe 4 hours a day.
So, does this explain why we get so few fucking clicks on Facebook? Because they systematically downrate commie shit like this? That's my explanation.
Maybe. I mean, I don't think there's big money in communism on Facebook.
Almost certainly not. This shit is fucking it's horrendous. And it's all in private hands. All this fucking it's tuned towards this profit imperative, so that if some fucking shell company for the Koch brothers shows up and says we want to push as much white supremacist shit as possible, the AIs just go, yeah, sure. We can do that optimization problem. We can shift people into a mindset where they're willing to click on your shit, on your stuff. It's fuck. And yeah, I mean, it's already effective, right? It's already fucking doing stuff. I think the 2016 stuff really stands out as oh shit, this stuff really is kind of out of control. And we're in the middle of the fucking ramp up to 2020, right? Christ.
Yeah, and on information theory or like cybernetics way looking at it, it's also a weird variety attenuator that it really is it's a little cruise control for where your mind can wander when you're in minimally when you're in the mind state when you're on social media, which is also it's also trying to increase. But I mean anyway, because as you're saying your thoughts aren't just originating from you, they are embedded in your social context. And if you've got this thing that's optimizing your social context toward really just ridiculous shit, the fact that what we're optimizing for is extracting profits for these idiots. Like, like that will lead us to mass death.
Yeah, totally. And like, it's so, like, I mean, you sometimes still get the sort of defense of like this internet stuff as like, in the spirit of the original sort of thing with the internet of like, oh, huge information superhighway, like people would have availability of any information they could ever want and they could learn anything and that sort of thing. But then in practice, you spend all your time in these fucking Facebook silos, and as you said, it's a variety attenuator. It is anti-educational because the things that are put on the screen are specifically steered towards what the algorithm wants. You're not like generally learning anything. You're not gaining. It's contrary to that kind of view of like, oh, being plugged into the matrix and seeing all the news and, having all the fucking images flash by your eyes and like you're really plugged in, you're really online, you're wired, that kind of thing. And it's like, no, it's so much more narrow than that. It's so much more like
you're drinking your own backwash. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly, because like experience has shown, like even if you have, say, like public access, like educational channels, like they do in France or whatever, or in Japan for that matter, they have a channel like that you can watch. It's like people do already attenuate variety, like that's just part of what we do, and so we are already sort of attracted to things that we're familiar with, or that fall into certain like channels of thinking that we're familiar with. And when you engineer a massive system to reinforce that tendency, it really does run right up against that utopian promise of what the internet was supposed to be, in terms of the sort of the Library of Alexandria, but greater at your fingertips all the time.
I can't help but remember, like, maybe way back in the cybernetic brain, and it's in Brain of the Firm as well, right? But like Beer's theory of crisis, you have these kind of low variety channels, an extremely high variety situation, such as the world, that is then represented through low variety channels where there are feedback loops that kind of ever increasingly constrain the variety of the channels. And so the sort of popular model of the world and the situation just drifts further and further away from reality over time, and that kind of just makes crisis worse and worse.
Yeah, I think there is this part where he notes that like the techniques that are being used now are not strictly logistic regression. There is actually like new research being done
by him,
which gets to the exactly, which gets to the 80% of relevant engineers, including himself, being employed at these companies. And this really reminds me like of when I was studying information society theory for my MA thesis. Like a lot of the people who were writing that stuff were like very closely connected to industry, and they had like this really deep sense of discomfort with what the technology was being used for, but they also just sort of resorted to magical thinking in order to imagine a way in which the stuff they were working on and cared about could be used for good ends instead of the ones that they actually anticipated happening. There's kind of this bifurcation between the world they expected and the world which they sort of projected as a utopia, and the utopia went on to actually be used as more propaganda for Silicon Valley, right? So it's a weird dynamic that happens for these people who are closest to the technology, closest to the new the sort of cutting edge, but are made sort of very deeply uncomfortable by their own work.
We get a bit of rhyming with that in the kind of closing section as to like what is to be done about this. The author says like that the issue isn't the AI itself; it's the issue is control, and that the solution is to put users back in charge. Transparency, configurability, this sort of stuff.
I agree. Abolish private property. I think you're getting there, dude.
yeah,
totally.
Exactly.
It's frustrating because I think the author is like inches away from getting it, but unfortunately this kind of last section is very much in the kind of vein of like the answer to every question is always another startup. It's like you got to build the anti-Facebook and this kind of stuff. It's
or how about the workers who are working for Facebook right now? Which like he's almost there. Like he's so close. Like I find it hopeful personally that like he's almost to the point of just saying owners should not control all this. Like the actual people who are affected by it. We should democratize the economy. You should have some say in decisions that affect you. Oh, and like the people who work for these companies, they don't want this. It's not to their benefit either. Like there's a common interest in the people who were exploited and the people who are working there. So the workers have to do something. He thinks they should make another startup, but I think history has provided us with other things workers can do.
But even if you make the startup, it's going to be beholden to fucking Saudi VC money anyway.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You're going to be stuck in the same pattern.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, totally. I think
funded by whom? Yeah.
I agree that like there's definitely opportunity. Like I think he genuinely is very close to getting it. There's in the article itself though, there's an unfortunate kind of emphasis of like setting up the right market conditions to like the market incentives to get the outcome you want, and it's just such a lib thing to like. Oh, read Marx, please. Please read Marx.
At least Google Murray Bookchin. I think you really click with it,
Yes. Yeah, and I think that I think part of the reason why this article sort of got written in the first place is that these issues of manipulation that we were talking about earlier are very much sort of like common concerns between Marxists and liberals, right? Because for liberals, this is like infringing on individual rationality. And that is sort of like the foundation of liberal thought, right? And so, and there's also the fact that like these algorithms don't really discriminate in terms of who they are manipulating. They'll try to manipulate everybody. So they're not class blind by any means, but they are also not class targeted in the way that might make liberals just not give a shit about and so I think that helps to create this kind of like common area of concern between the two positions.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, like this is, I think, there's a huge amount of commonality. It's, it's very close. And I desperately hope this author gets radicalized.
Yeah, I mean, Marx started as a liberal, right?
Yeah. We can't have been born perfect, right? Like, we have to get there eventually.
There's like a big leftist idea of how, like, the petty bourgeois is more likely to, side with the capitalists because their interests are more aligned, and just not necessarily. Like, there's this shit that really does affect you, like regardless of who you are. Probably tech savvy people like more, but and also people with disposable income more in general. But and also look, capital wants to de-skill you and eventually kill you. Like like there are reasons. Like I see a glimmer of hope in this and other arguments that and the thing is, like, it wouldn't need to be that many engineers revolting in order to cause massive problems.
Yeah, I mean, like we've said that before, right? That like the kind of tech workers are in a similar place to where sort of railway workers or and such were previously. This is sort of a pivot point in the economy. I
think when we get into his particular recommendations, we can kind of take a brief look at them, just to see, like, okay, some of this is liberal nonsense, but some of it is stuff you might just see in Feenberg, right? Like, any algorithmic newsfeed with significant adoption should transparently convey what objectives the feed algorithm is currently optimizing for and how these objectives are affecting your information diet. So, when you think about the traditional media landscape, it's generally been the case that news outlets will take particular political positions, right? In the sort of early stage of print news, you would have like leftist papers and then the big capitalist papers that sort of moved on to being different types of capitalist papers. and you have news channels that tend to side with a certain political side, and that kind of gives you, by reputation, a sense of what the objectives the feed algorithm is optimizing for. Even though oftentimes the variety of feeds is too limited to actually give you as much information as you ought to have. But when you get to something like Facebook, there's a lot of, because it's all in a unitary feed, there's a lot less clarity there. And so, this would kind of help to fulfill that function. I'm somewhat skeptical. This feels a little bit too naive about politics.
Yes. But why would Facebook do this? Why? Key bono.
This feels very like very much like the Habermas ideal speech situation, right? Like this is a thing that could never actually exist, but it's an ideal that they're shooting for.
No, that's a great idea, and if the economy was controlled democratically, I think that should be something that people should definitely look at.
Absolutely. So then the next one was give you intuitive tools to set these goals yourself. For instance, it should be possible for you to configure your newsfeed to maximize learning and personal growth in specific directions. And it's not to say that there haven't been like web technologies that aimed in that direction, but they're certainly not the ones we have today. And then go ahead.
There are kind of ways like to sort of hack it to do that. To be completely honest, like my Facebook newsfeed, I don't know if you have an Android, like when you swipe like all the way like to the left. It just gives you like articles. It is actually creepily useful. Like I have Googled like technical problems, and then the next day I see really just excellent blog posts, like talking about exactly like what I wanted the other day. That is, it's a little creepy, but I mean it's incredibly useful actually. And then at that point you can actually even start to sort of train it to like, okay, I'm gonna click on a bunch of this kind of stuff, and then you see a bunch of related stuff, like in the next day. It actually recommended me. I was looking into like FPGAs, and it recommended me a blog post about recreating old Soviet computers with FPGAs. It's like, okay, man, Google. You know what, Google? I feel like you're on my side. Actually, I feel like you're helping me achieve what I want to do in this world.
Yep. Get that ternary computing.
Hell
going.
Yeah.
Nice. The next one is feature an always visible measure of how much time you are spending on the feed. So, some video games do this, right? Maybe 4X games or MMOs, games that are notorious for encouraging self-destructive behavior. They offer that kind of thing, but you certainly don't get that on Facebook, and that to some extent, depending on the game, maybe because the game creators' interests align more closely with the users. But in the case of Facebook, they're quite antagonistic.
Yeah, because they don't actually make more money. Yeah, they don't make more money by you playing the game for more hours. Like, it's more like a casino where, knowing how long how much time you've been spending there is the last thing in the world that they want, and they, spend a considerable amount designing the space to make it intentionally hard.
Yeah, and that's where they overlap with like gacha games, that kind of thing, that are really based on the casino model. And then we also have feature tools to stay in control of how much time you're spending on the feed, such as a daily time target, past which the algorithm will seek to get you off the feed. Man, that would be great. You can also hack this.
Yeah.
Right?
If only the business wasn't funded by ads, like
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
This is another thing that you can hack yourself, right? Like there are like browser add-ons and that kind of thing that can help you do this, but like they tend to be a little bit buggy because they're not actually working in concert with the platform. It's like these are like things that are eminently feasible at a technological level. There's no real engineering problem here. And then there's this very important line here. we should build AI to serve humans, not to manipulate them for profit or political gain. What if newsfeed algorithms didn't operate like casino operators or propagandists? It's like, yeah.
Yeah, what if we had communism?
Maybe we need, yeah, exactly. We need to emphasize use values over exchange values. Maybe that's the thing here. Yeah.
Maybe this cloud infrastructure and the machine learning models that run on it, that are the modern, the 21st century means of production. Maybe they shouldn't be owned by some assholes, and should be and society should decide like what gets done with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, a mixed bag for that. But oh yeah, so close. Like, I mean, this is so kind of right up our alley, except for some of the conclusions. But yeah,
yeah. I mean, it ends on the anti-Facebook idea, which again, like it's very much. Trying, like, it's a recommendation to try the same thing again and hope it'll work out with exactly the same kinds of problems going into it's just like, oh, you know what, we didn't do right at Google, we weren't not evil enough. That was the problem.
For the sake of any listeners or even potentially the author might be listening, hello if you are.
I love Keras, by the way. It's an amazing package. It is so good. I love your API design philosophy in general. You made a great blog post about it. It's wonderful. It's declarative. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But if anyone's wondering what we keep going on about here, where we seem to have knowledge of why this is insufficient, you can go back to our previous episode on platform capitalism, which is, or even read that book, which is a full rundown of why we believe that. So that is the concrete recommendation there. If you're kind of scratching your head as to like, why are they so down on some of this stuff? With very concrete reasons that were explored in that episode. Yeah, I mean, is there anything else we want to cover before we sort of wrap it up?
There was one quote that from his book on deep learning in Python that like I feel like is is kind of relevant. So he's talking about when you're choosing like exactly what you're training your machine learning thingy to optimize. Choosing the right objective function for the right problem is extremely important. Your network will take any shortcut it can to minimize the loss. So if the objective doesn't fully correlate with success for the task at hand, your network will end up doing things you may not have wanted. Imagine a stupid, omnipotent AI trained by a stochastic gradient descent with this poorly chosen objective function. Maximize the average well-being of all humans alive. To make its job easier, this AI might choose to kill all humans except a few and focus on the well-being of the remaining ones, because average well-being isn't affected by how many human beings are left. That might not be what you intended. Just remember that all neural networks you build will be just as ruthless in lowering their loss function, so choose the objective wisely or you'll have to face unintended side effects. Sounds like capitalism itself, am I right? Except our current objective function, maximize shareholder value, isn't even as nice as that one.
Yep. No, totally. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Because, you spend time with capitalists and they're not really very happy people.
Nah, they're really not.
So I don't think the system really optimizes for their well-being.
It definitely doesn't. Even if they get everything they wanted, they are still disciplined by this monstrous fucking alien force. Like it's
it's not their happiness either. It's just like that's just the one signal it can read. There's a famous experiment of like there's this fly that like the only way that it knows that it's eaten enough is how much its stomach is stretching, and you can cut the nerve that goes there, and it will literally eat until it explodes.
Yep. Oh boy, bad stuff.
I'm hopeful though. I think we need a little more. For better or for worse, there's a lot of sort of can-do optimism in the culture of this, and let's apply it. There's a pessimism that can set in, but you know what? Like, you don't know what's going to happen. Any outcome is possible. Life is chaos. Like nothing. there's no reason to write things off as hopeless.
Totally. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's the project of the show, right? I mean, like, try to capture some of that techie enthusiasm and channel it towards the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism, you know?
Hell yeah.
Oh, fuck.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, I guess that's a great place to wrap it up. Thanks, listeners, for listening, and thanks, Matt, for coming along on this adventure with us. It's been wonderful.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's been wonderful to have you. Yeah, if we give the guests the sort of last word, is there anything you'd like to plug or etc.?
Did you ever talk about like that a letter that Norbert Wiener wrote to UAW?
No. What's
No.
this?
I mean, it's sort of relevant. So basically, we were talking about how like he the blog author, kind of glossed over technological unemployment, and Norbert Wiener actually wrote a letter to UAW about how he wanted to basically cut a deal, help them cut a deal to make sure that they got a piece of automation, but they didn't listen to him. I don't know, it's cool. Google it.
Interesting.
Don't find me.
Oh fuck, we're probably gonna have to read that then.
Yeah, we should check it out for sure.
Yeah, there's nothing I want people to find about me specifically. That
Okay, that's fine.
That's very much fair.
Very much so. You can find us though on the internet at generalintellectunit.net. We're on Twitter as GIUnitPod because they don't allow longer usernames. We're on Facebook if you can find us, because the algorithm might have hidden us by now. I don't know. If you want to help the show, subscribe, rate, all that kind of crap. Share us around with people you think might be interested, or probably the bottom of the barrel in terms of helping us out is to go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit. Kick us a couple of bucks a month. At the $5 a month level, you'll get access to our community Discord, which is a hopping place full of great conversation. Yeah, I guess that's everything. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Laters, gators.
Bye.